Coming up on the Mindful Midlife Crisis.
I had just finished reading this chapter that was like, when have you been your best self? And so I kind of closed the book and then I went for a walk on the beach and I was like, when have I been my best self? When have I been? And immediately, kind of that like gut response that kind of comes up to the surface right away. And it's like, when have you been your best self? And I'm like, it's right now in this exact moment. But then, think about the other voice on the shoulder that's like, okay, you just lost your husband like 2 months ago, 3 months ago. How can this be your best self right now? Like, who are you kidding? And I'm like, I feel so free to do what I want and to live this life how it sees fit, right? Because you have these moments of clarity, like when you realize how short life really is. And so, anyways, immediately I felt guilty. Like, how could this be like my best life only because of losing someone? And I felt like then it started to kind of become this prayer. And like I was talking to God about it and just like kind of wrestling with this idea. And he was like, the gift of Darren's life, short life, is to help you step into the fullness of your own.
Welcome to the Mindful Midlife Crisis, a podcast for people navigating the complexities and possibilities of life's second half. I'm your host, Billy Lahr, an educator, personal trainer, meditation teacher, and overthinker who talks to experts who specialize in social and emotional learning, mindfulness, physical and emotional wellness, cultural awareness, finances, communication, relationships, dating, and parenting, all in an effort to help us better reflect, learn, and grow so we can live a more purpose-filled life. Take a deep breath, embrace the present, and journey with me through the Mindful Midlife Crisis. Welcome to the Mindful Midlife Crisis. I'm your host, Billy Lahr. Thank you for tuning in wherever you are. The purpose of this show is to provide a platform that gives people the space and permission to share their expertise and life experiences in order to help others navigate the complexities and possibilities of life's second half. And remember, this free and useful information is helpful to people of all ages. Wisdom isn't about one's age. Wisdom comes from our ability to reflect, learn, and grow from our own life experiences, while also learning from the experiences of others, regardless of what stage of life we are in, because you just never know what life is going to throw at you. So there just might be a conversation or two from past episodes that help you feel a little bit better prepared for the challenges you might face in life or that you're facing right now, whether those challenges be your emotional, mental, and or physical health, your relationships with others, including your partner and children, your career, your finances, whatever curveballs life is throwing your way right now. Just know that you are not alone in your experience, and the conversations I'm having here are with people who have been there before or have done the research to help you navigate these situations with more awareness, openness, curiosity, and compassion so you can live a more purpose-filled life. And trust me, I take all of these conversations I'm having to heart as well, and I try to apply what I'm learning from these conversations in my own life, which is why I do solo episodes the first Wednesday of every month, because I think of this show as a running dialogue between me and you, the listener, because my hope is that you can see and hear the growth I'm making in my own life so that it inspires you to seek out the connections between our shared experiences so that you too can take intentional and inspired action. So, if you're looking for some ways to help you better navigate whatever you've got going on in your life from someone who's been through it before, check out some of these other episodes at www.mindfulmidlifecrisis.com or wherever you get your podcasts. This week's episode focuses on grief and loss. It's an emotional story, okay? So buckle up. Make sure you take care of yourself during and after you've finished listening to this episode. If you'd like to hear more stories of how people navigate grief and loss, check out episode 45 with cancer survivor Joy Huber, where she talks about how beating stage 4 cancer has given her a new lease on life. Episode 46 with Michael Mosher, where he talks about how he's been navigating his own mental health struggles. Episode 47 with Marie Nutter, where she talks about navigating the grief of losing her brother while also tending to her role as a nurse. Episode 60 with near-death survivor Danny Bader, whose story literally made me cry during our conversation. Whew, That was a doozy. And so was episode 73 with Jason Clausen, who talks about how he navigated the grief he experienced after losing his wife to cancer. It's very similar to today's story. If you make it through all of those episodes, and if you make it through today's episode, you should probably hug someone because there's a lot of emotion going on right there. So, with that, let's meet today's guest. Today's guest is Becky Allen. Becky has navigated her fair share of life's curveballs, including surviving cancer, infertility, losing her own husband to cancer, and navigating life as a single mom. Through all of this, Becky has come to understand that hard things change us. Becky shares her story as a public speaker and is also the host of the Win the Day podcast. Becky blends authenticity, faith, and humor to break down ideas and provide practical steps to shift your perspectives so you know that you are not alone. Becky is a mom to two incredible kids. She's a creative and overthinker with a constant drive to improve. She loves the beach, tacos, cold brew, more tacos, a good meme, and all things Enneagram. So, welcome to the show, Becky Allen.
Hey, it's good to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. I believe we connected through matchmaker.fm. And just to clarify, Matchmaker is not a dating service. It's a weird name for
I know.
podcasters. It's weird, but matchmaker.fm actually matches podcast hosts and podcast guests and that kind of thing. So when I read your story, I was like, you need to be a guest on this show just because you've had so many incredible and tragic experiences, but you still find a way to really enjoy life. And to me, that just speaks so highly to your mindset. And I had to get in contact with you and I had to learn more about your story. So I'm so happy that you're here. Thank you for joining us.
Of course. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Wonderful. So, one of the things we always ask our guests is what 10 roles they play in their life. So, what are 10 roles that you play in your life?
Yes, I would say this was a fun question. It was a fun way to think about the different parts that I'm involved in, but I'd say mom, widow, friend, podcaster, speaker, creator, girlfriend, Christian, optimist, and improver.
Wonderful. And so then we always ask, what 3 roles are you most looking forward to in the second half of life? And you first and foremost, you put mom right here. What is it that you're looking forward to in the second half of life when it comes to being a mom?
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like I'm just kind of coming over this, I don't know, season or way of parenting where my kids are really pretty independent. I don't have to get them dressed or brush their teeth for them. They can make their own food. And so my energy as a mom and my time is spent more having really fun conversations with them and seeing them kind of become their own people and have their own ideas and thoughts and sense of humor. And so I feel like we kind of have become this little unit that is kind of all in on the same jokes and conversation points. And I personally, being a mom to little kids is really difficult. It's not I'm not loving the baby stage so much. So this part
I always love
of
when people are super honest about that.
uh it was not easy. I'm not good on low sleep. And so I turned into a monster for several years. And so nobody wants that. So it's been fun. It's fun to see them find their own passions and things. And I've just really, it's the start of this kind of new part of parenting, which I'm really excited about.
How old are your kids now?
They are almost 13 and 8. So third grade and seventh grade.
Oh, wow. So you already have the 8-year-old doing breakfast. I don't have kids, so I don't know
Yeah.
when it's appropriate. And then when I look back on my own life, I think that I was pretty spoiled as a child. And I mean, that probably comes off in every episode that we do here. But, it impresses me when kids become self-reliant at a young age. I don't know that I was self-reliant at a young age. I'm sure if my sisters are listening, they're like, no, you were worthless. But they had to figure that out probably at a young age because if you were a single mom, and I
Mhm.
imagine you're navigating the emotions of losing your husband and they're navigating the emotions of losing their dad at a young age. So,
Mhm.
do you think that help them become more self-reliable?
Oh, for sure. I mean, there's just very little margin in my life. And so it was like, you got to pull your weight here. And I will say, I'm super grateful. My oldest is a boy and he is super tenderhearted. He's a great teacher. And so he just naturally kind of fits that role too. I mean, typical firstborn also. But as a boy, he's very tender. And so he is very sweet at like helping teach his little sister stuff and making breakfast for her or helping her tie her shoes, when she was younger and just little things like that, that he just sort of naturally kind of stepped into. And it's funny because I mean, I think as a parent, we all can struggle with guilt, right? Like mom guilt, you hear about all the time. And I always try to think about my childhood growing up. And I had a great childhood. It was very happy and wonderful. And like, I don't ever remember feeling like, did my mom sit down and play with me enough? And, like, did I have enough meals and was I cooking them? Or like, it's so much we get kind of caught up in that I think like, that doesn't really matter. So trying to keep that in mind too. But you can certainly get down some rabbit holes with that stuff too.
And through a lot of your experiences, you have turned that into speaking and podcasting. And podcasting is something that you're looking forward to in the second half of life. Tell us more about your show, Win the Day.
Yeah, totally. So I absolutely love hearing people's stories, understanding the why behind things, trying to pick up on things that people do differently that might make a difference or that I can learn from. And I just think it's so important for people to feel seen. Like that just adds such groundedness to us as people. Like we just want to be seen. Like I don't need someone to tell me that I'm right or wrong or special or all these things. But if someone notices you, I just think that goes a really far, like a long way. And so being able to have this podcast for partially that, right? Hearing people's stories, what was your hard thing that you had to come through and how did it change you? How did it make you angry? How does that change how you live now? Like on the other side of it, not that it's ever gone per se, but it does change. So that's half of it. And then the other half of it actually has sort of been as much as possible like an open journal session of what my life has looked like the last several years. And, I joke on my podcast that I'm the anti-expert because I don't have it figured out. I'm trying to kind of stumble my way through, but I'm a deep thinker. I like thinking about process and concepts and ideas and where can I improve and why do I do this differently? And just been a good placeholder for me to sort of force me, like, I've got to put out content. So, like, what have I been thinking about? What have I been reading and learning? And so it's been something that all people going through things can kind of come alongside with me and like we can learn together.
I like that idea of being the anti-expert because I definitely relate to that because my dad always used to say, do as I say, not as I do. And I think that I can give good advice. I don't always follow through with it on my own. And like, interestingly enough, we had Jason Clausen on earlier and he lost his wife to cancer. And he talked about as a therapist that he was giving all this advice about how to navigate emotions, but it was really hard for him to even take that own advice as he was
Mm.
doing that too. And for me, especially when I was doing the summer sessions, it helped me kind of get out all of the thoughts that I had been having in 6 months of traveling in 2022. And so I use this in the same way, but I like that idea of giving people an opportunity to share their story because I was just having this conversation the other day that people like to share about themselves. People like to talk and sometimes they just need to have that. And I enjoy providing that experience and it sounds like you do as well.
Yeah, most definitely. There's definitely been some podcasts, where you get to the end of it, and I don't know if you agree or this has happened to you, but you're kind of like, wasn't maybe like the most riveting interview, but you can just tell how healing it was for them, right? To kind of go have a full circle moment and talk through it. And so, yeah, to be able to give that to people and it's good. And I mean, I'm better for it too. So,
All of our episodes are riveting. I'm not sure if you're aware of that or not, because it's just, I mean, if the guest isn't riveting, then I carry the load for it.
sure. Yes, yes. I have been there. I have been there.
So
Oh my gosh.
you did not list wife someday in your top 10, but you did list girlfriend. Are you dropping hints here on the air to your now boyfriend where you're like, hey, time is ticking. I would like to be a wife again. I feel like maybe you are passive
Hint,
aggressively
hint.
hinting at.
Oh, I'll aggressively hint too. It's fine. No, I guess I didn't even really think about like talking it through, but like, I mean, I loved being married. Like, I loved the partnership. I love feeling like you've got somebody to like do life with. And I had a beautiful marriage. I mean, yes, it was not perfect, but like we grew up together. We became adults together. We started a family together. So I really had such a positive experience with marriage, which I know is very honestly, it's really uncommon. And so that's part of my lens looking at this too. But I feel like I have grown and evolved so much. It's been like, gas pedal all the way down. I mean, I've been in therapy and continue to go, and it's been a huge impact for me. And she was talking about how it's like you sort of are forced into this like self growth, like roller coaster, where you're kind of like, can I just get off for a second? But through that, I really feel like I have so much to offer now more than ever, like as a partner, and so to be able to share that and build that with somebody. And I think, when we have these moments in life that really are clarifying moments of what matters and what doesn't, it's really so much of the small stuff that really matters. And for me, I found that in kind of this like, quote unquote monotony of sort of the grind of life, where you come home and you're having dinner together, you're just sitting on the couch, talking about your day or watching a show, like just these little things. So, anyways, and dating could be a whole nother podcast because that has been like an experience to say the least, and nothing like what I thought it was going to be like because I never really dated before, I was married even. So this was all totally new to me. And so you learn a lot about people and yourself. And yes, I am in a great relationship now, and it's been super fun getting to know him and spending time together and blending our families, and just thinking about what that looks like in the second half of my life is something I'm definitely looking forward to.
Wonderful. Well, we're going to do this. We're going to take a quick break and then we're going to go back to the past year and just talk about some of these significant life events that have happened to Becky and how they have had an impact on her and how she still continues to win the day. Thank you for listening to the Mindful Midlife Crisis. Thank you for listening to the Mindful Midlife Crisis. If you're enjoying what you've heard so far, please do me a favor and hit the subscribe button. Also, giving the show a quick 5-star review with a few kind words helps others find and benefit from this podcast just like you are. Finally, please spread the wealth of free knowledge and advice in this episode by sharing it with the people in your life who may find this information and my mission to help others live a more purpose-filled life valuable. My hope is that these conversations resonate with others and inspire people to live their best lives. Thanks again. And now, back to the show. Welcome back to the Mindful Midlife Crisis. We are here with Becky Allen. She is the host of the Win the Day podcast. Becky has quite the story, and we're going to dive into it here. Becky, to say that you have faced some challenges in your life would be a significant understatement. So can you walk us through some of life's perils from your 20s?
Yeah, totally. So I got married really young. I was 22. I grew up with my late husband, and we were going to wait and have kids. We kind of had this like planned out, right? And then good friends of ours that had got married a couple months before us, they got pregnant accidentally. And once the baby was here, I was kind of like, okay, baby fever like was definitely there. So I was like, we're changing the plans. We're having a baby right now. And so we did. Being a new mom is challenging. I mean, I grew up nannying and babysitting, so I thought it was going to be a piece of cake. Definitely not. It was challenging for sure, but it was also the start of like our family. So it was a really beautiful moment. And, fast forward about a year and a half after our son was born, we were like, all right, let's have baby number 2. So we started trying, and it didn't happen the first couple months like what it had with our son. But we kind of kept moving on in the process. And then a month I found myself pregnant. So we were super excited, totally ecstatic. And about 6 weeks later, I started bleeding, and I knew, obviously that wasn't good. And so went into the emergency room and was having a miscarriage. And so obviously was sad. I mean, it wasn't what we had. I mean, I never even crossed my mind really that I could have a miscarriage, but I was pretty like focused on like, no, we're having baby number two, And so we tried again the next month, and I got pregnant and had another miscarriage, or it could have been a continuation. I'm not exactly sure. And so then the doctor was like, you need to just give yourself like 3 months time and rest, and let's pick this up like later on and we'll talk about it, but like let your body, heal and rest. And so I was doing that. And meanwhile, I just was feeling off. Like my stomach was really distended and I had low energy, and something wasn't quite right. And I would kind of bring this to my doctor's attention, and it was sort of poo-pooed a little bit, I guess. I mean, I didn't know any different. I didn't know to be an advocate for myself. So fast forward 3 months in this time frame, it was in the spring that I'd had the miscarriages. And so now it's middle of July, and I was at home, and when you get a bad stomach ache where you ate something and you're like, oh my gosh, if I just get sick, like get this out of my system, like I'll be way better. And I kind of thought it was one of those. I was like, what did I eat today? And so I was getting sick, but the pain was growing more intense instead of like diminishing. And I'm like, this isn't right. This isn't normal. Something's wrong. And I actually ended up passing out from the pain at home because it was so intense. And so Darren, my husband, he came and found me and drove me to the hospital. And we got there and they were doing some blood work and tests. And they came in and they said, did you know you're 14 weeks pregnant? And I'm like doing the math in my head. I'm like, nah, no, I'm not, like, that's literally not possible. And also like, even if I was, which would have been like a miracle, like to be in that much pain, I knew it wasn't going to add up. So they were trying to figure out what was going on. So we were there all through the night running tests. And the next morning around 5 a.m., Darren was like, I'm starving. I've got to go get some food. I'm like, yeah, of course, go eat. I'm just literally sitting here. So of course he leaves. And then my doctor comes in, this little petite, fiery woman. And she was like, okay, your test just came back. You had an ectopic pregnancy and your tube ruptured and you're bleeding out. And we've got to get you into surgery immediately or you're not going to make it. And oh, by the way, you're at the wrong hospital. So I pulled my car up front because we don't have time to wait for an ambulance to take you. So I'm going to get you in a wheelchair and bring you out to my car. And we're going to go to the other hospital and get the surgery. I'm like, but my husband's not here. She's like, he's going to have to figure it out. Like, we have to go. We don't have time. So thankfully, like on our way out to the door, he saw us and jumped in with us. And so she drove us over to the hospital, and literally like I'm signing like release forms as they're like rushing me into surgery, and they remove the tube, and I'm in the hospital recovering, and I was so out of it. Like I remember they kept being like, all right, it's time to eat or walk or go home, and I just remember thinking like, you're out of your mind. Like I can barely keep my eyes open for more than 30 seconds. Like there's no way.
Can you explain, like, what is this rupture? Can you talk about, like, what this
Of course.
is?
Yeah. When you're pregnant, you have an egg that's fertilized and it becomes an embryo as it grows. And typically it happens in your uterus, which is then where you see women's bellies grow and the baby continue to develop. But what happened was the egg, when I was ovulating, didn't fully release. And so it was fertilized like in the tube still. So it's trying to grow, but it can't because it's limited essentially because it's in a tube. So what had happened is it kept growing and the cells kept multiplying to the point where it couldn't fit in my tube anymore. So it ruptured the tube. And so that's where the bleeding and the pain, and that's why my stomach was distended, is because I had this mass growing in me that I didn't know about and why I was so uncomfortable. And so a couple days later, it was the weekend, I was at home recovering. I was taking a nap on the couch and I woke up and I had a missed call from my doctor. And honestly, the first thing I thought was like, why would my doctor call me on a Saturday? Like, there's no way this is good. So I called and she immediately answered, which also I knew was not good. And then she proceeded to tell me that they had tested the tissue that they had removed from the ruptured tube, which I also did not know they were going to do. And that the test results had come back that I had a type of cancer called choriocarcinoma. So basically, that mass of cells from that embryo was never really like a legitimate pregnancy. And so the cells just kept multiplying rapidly, which essentially is what cancer is. So it became cancerous tissues. And so because my tube had ruptured, they had no idea of how far this thing had really run because it's a blood-borne cancer. And so she needed me to come in the next Monday to do some blood work, some testing, some imaging so that they could figure out if this was like a staged cancer and like what my treatment plan would be. I mean, I think at the time I was 25. So then all of a sudden I'm going from let's expand our family and have a baby to then because of that I have cancer. Like it was like the hardest, weirdest connection point because it felt like such opposite directions in my head.
Well, what a wild 3 years too, because if you got married at 22 and you
Yeah.
weren't thinking about having children right away, and then all of a sudden the baby fever kicked in, and then you had a baby, and by my math, 9 to 10 months is what that happens, and then all of a sudden to have 3 miscarriages, and then to be diagnosed with cancer, like, what a whirlwind
Yeah.
of experiences for
hmm
you.
Yeah. It was very bizarre and hard to process. And so I ended up going through it had not progressed, thankfully, but because it was a blood-borne illness and my tube had ruptured, they're like, there could be some microscopic bits that we can't detect, and we don't want those to start multiplying and growing. So I went through 6 weeks of chemo, and then they said that, no getting pregnant for a year, let your body heal and recover. And then after that, basically after that year, if your numbers are still good, you're pretty much released from our care and can go on and do what you want. So through that year, actually, like there was sort of this freedom and like lease on life, which I'll touch on later because I felt that again too, actually, in after Darren passed away. But there's these defining moments, right, where I'm like, I almost died. So what am I going to do now that I'm still here? And what actually matters, what doesn't, like your perspective changes and it should. And so I wanted to live that out. And so there was really this like freedom and joy and kind of this new way that I wanted to live my life. And really since then, with that happening so young, that was, 12 years ago, I've really honestly can say I really don't take much for granted, like as far as time and relationships and experiences and memories and stuff, because of that experience happening at such a young age. But then what got challenging is that after that year of waiting was over, we were able to try again. And it took about a year and a half until I ended up getting pregnant. So if you count in the time we were trying before. I mean, and then I was sick and couldn't try for a year, but it was still a thought in my mind. And then adding another year and a half, there was about 3 years or so, 3.5 years of waiting to be a mom again. And I sort of became fixated on that and about specifically, I don't know why, but specifically about the age difference between my kids and feeling like each day that passed, I was taking away from the opportunity of them to have a close relationship. And I don't know, anybody that's been through like infertility, like you're constantly calculating. Like if I get pregnant this month, I would be pregnant at Christmas. I would have the baby at this month. I would have like a 3 or, and you're constantly redoing this. And so every month you're not just trying, but you're also moving these dates around. And it really messes with you. Like it's an emotional roller coaster. And honestly, like that the waiting to be able to have another child was almost a more difficult experience than the cancer was for me.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because as you're sharing what you just talked about there, it reminded me of a friend of mine who she has an 18-year-old daughter and she also has, I think he's a 10-year-old son now. And she is conscious of people's perception of that age gap. Like, why is there such an age gap there? And it's because she had miscarriages and she has to explain that if she chooses, right? But
Yeah.
I think that that's something that weighs on her. And it's obviously something that is lost on me until I hear you share that right there. And that it sounds like there's some mental anguish that goes along with the timing of having siblings.
Yeah. Well, I think too, right? We make these choices in our life, or sometimes they're made for us. And because it puts us down this certain path, we build a community there, right? You meet like minded people, people that are in similar situations as you. So then you start doing life with those people. Well, I was doing life with all of these new moms that I had met when my son was a baby, and they were all like just like on this plan to like have all of these kids, 2 years exactly apart and to keep going. So all of a sudden I felt like I was falling behind. Like I was going to be forgotten because these people, this community I was in, all of a sudden I felt like I didn't necessarily belong. And obviously that was a story I was telling myself, but that's how it started to feel. Like I was being left behind and everyone was just going to move on seamlessly because everything was sort of falling into place for them. And I all of a sudden felt like the place I had walked myself to no longer fit me anymore. Which that's something, again, I also experienced later on too, more intensely. But I think that was part of what was so difficult.
Well, and that brings me to an observation that I made in the first episode of your podcast was like how quickly you breezed through that story, that everything you just shared right there. And when you and I talked in our first meeting, I pointed that out to you, and we talked about, were you in such a baby making mindset that despite battling and overcoming cancer, that you weren't really present and you were focused on what our friends, Dr. Yolanda Holloway and Tiffany Bird, call the checklist? And
Mhm.
so, does that resonate? Does that seem to sink in right there that you had the baby checklist or the life checklist, and you were so focused on that it was almost like, well, I don't have time to process. I don't have time. Get this cancer out of me, and we got to go. And then it sounds like you shifted your mindset after that.
It's funny in hearing and talking about this in depth because I really haven't done this maybe ever or in a very long time, anyways. There's a lot of mirroring in this part of my story that happens once Darren passes and how I process and handle grief and different situations that came up. Because I almost feel like, I mean, I couldn't even say the word cancer for like years. I just would say I was sick because I didn't want to connect with the word. I had almost like an aversion to it. Like it just made my tongue thick and my throat feel like it was going to close. And I think I hid my grief and processing in my planning of what was next for me. And so it was way easier to think about being a mom and growing my family and how exciting and what will the nursery look like and what could we name the baby and what pregnancy clothes will I wear instead of thinking about like, what in the hell did I just go through? And so I think that it was a case of that.
Well, then, if we fast forward a bit,
Yeah.
life threw you another curveball,
Hmm.
another crisis. When your husband Darren was diagnosed with testicular cancer. So,
Hmm.
walk us through that situation and how that was similar yet different from your diagnosis.
Let's see. That was about 7 years ago. Kind of almost is where it started, like right now. Like it's kind of can play through the seasons, but we had just built a house and we're getting ready to move in a couple weeks. And Darren was actually in a car accident about like I think he was parked and the woman was going maybe like 40. So he definitely got some whiplash and stuff. Like he walked away from it fine, but it definitely like he had a concussion and it kind of messed him up. And so when we were moving into this house, like he was just not right. And he was a personal trainer, a bodybuilder, Mr. Muscles. So like for him to not be able to like use his brawn to move his family into his new house was definitely difficult for him. And then it was kind of in moments like that where I would be like, something's not right. Like if he can't even do this, which normally he would kind of like grunt through and do, something's off. So it just seemed to kind of like take a long time for him to kind of like get back to himself. And so that was in the fall. And then he kept having these weird episodes of like these like weird stomach flare ups and like sharp back pains. And it felt like maybe he threw it out lifting or he had a sensitive stomach. And so it was like maybe he ate some fried food and it didn't agree with him, or there was just always seemed to be a reason. And as soon as it would come, it would leave. So it wasn't even really time to put a lot of thought into it. So then over the holiday season, we'd been in our house for a couple of months and Christmas, it's super stressful time for a family. I mean, it's beautiful and wonderful, but there's a lot to do, right? The wrapping presents, getting the gifts, the decorating, the making the cookies, putting up the tree, all those things. And he was like out of commission. Like he was in so much pain, which we thought at that time that he had thrown his back out lifting, that he was like couch ridden. And so I'm starting to get kind of resentful, right? Because it's like, oh, it must be nice to sit on the couch all Christmas. I'll take care of everything. Such a brat. Anyways, but then there was these moments again through the holidays where I knew he would grit through if he could, and he couldn't. And I'm like, this is not like him. Like, what's going on? And so right after Christmas was over, he made an appointment. He went into the doctor and he went by himself. I was home with the kids because we were like that certain it was like no big deal. And so they went in, they did an ultrasound or something to him, I think. And she was like, I'm fairly confident. No, they didn't do an ultrasound. It was just talking through. I think maybe they did some blood work. She's like, it sounds like it's your gallbladder. So we'll make an appointment for some imaging tomorrow, but we'll probably just remove it. You'll have a little bit of a modified diet and you'll be totally good to go. And so he came home. It's like, perfect. Awesome. Let's get you feeling better. So the next day he went in for imaging. Again, I stayed home with the kids. She made it seem like such a no-brainer that I didn't even consider anything different. So I remember I was sitting literally right in this exact same spot working from home, and his appointment was like taking forever. And again, never occurred to me something was wrong. Darren was super extroverted, so I always joke that like it was like as if he was in a parade wherever we went, hey, how you doing, whatever. And so I just honestly assumed he had made friends with people in the waiting room and got lost in conversation and just totally forgot what time it was. So he called and I picked up the phone in a snippy wife fashion. And I was like, hey, did you want to come home? Like what's going on? Where are you? And his voice was super somber. And he just said, well, they did the imaging and they think it's either Hodgkin's lymphoma or testicular cancer. I was like, what? Like, again, such a 180 from the way he lived. He made a career out of healthy living. He was literally like the last person I would ever have thought this would happen to. Like, he was Mr. Invincible. Like, it did not make any type of sense in my brain. So immediately, of course, I leave to go like be with him. And I pull into the clinic parking lot just as he's walking out. And he gets to the car and his phone rings and it's the doctor. And she's like, I'm so sorry, but it's testicular cancer and you need to go to this clinic here and start doing this. And, I wish it wasn't that. And at the time he was, I think, not quite 31. Anyways, young. And so then that started the series of, having surgery and chemo and just everything. And it just felt like it was 15 months of this battle and literally the most hellish 15 months of my life. To see someone you care about so much hurt and be suffering so greatly, and there's literally nothing you can do. Meanwhile, like having like a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old and trying to like keep their lives as normal as possible. Like they knew that he was sick. We didn't hide that from him. He slept a lot. He was pretty removed from their life, to be honest with you. It was kind of this like slow dissolve, which at the time was literally torture, but it made their grieving process so much, I don't want to say easier because that sounds weird, but it wasn't like this huge Band-Aid being ripped off, right? Like he already had been very removed from their daily living. And even for me too, right? Like I hadn't had real conversations with him. I hadn't been like treated as like a wife. I had been taking out the garbage and I'd been shoveling the driveway and paying the bills online and, doing all those things. It wasn't like I had to relearn them overnight. It was just kind of like as he couldn't do them, I took them over. I mean, we did everything. I felt like we did not go to one doctor's appointment with positive news ever. There was one brief moment, where we had thought he basically had kind of come out of it, but then he went back 6 weeks later for a checkup and it was back and spread in his brain and just like all over. And then got to the end and they were like, there's really nothing more that we can do for you. And we're like, sorry, that's not good enough, So then we did some alternative treatment at Reno at a facility that was incredible. I wish we would have known about it earlier. I don't know if it would have made a difference or not, but their philosophies and ways of doing things were incredible. But we came home beginning of March. So it had been about a year and 3 months or so since he had been sick. And he was bad. I mean, I remember my parents thankfully flew out to Reno to help us home, which I would have never been able to do it. And he was on oxygen and he weighed about 160 pounds. He was normally like 230, probably, comes home in a wheelchair, super pale, like bald. And I remember too, actually, I didn't see this, but my mom caught it when we were leaving the airport. He saw a serviceman and like saluted him and shook his hand and thanked him for his service while he's like days away from, passing. It's just like, that's kind of who he was, just so others focus. But anyways, we were at home and I was really struggling because I could tell that we were kind of near the end. And I was so afraid that there was going to be some kind of situation that would happen at home because he wanted to be home. And honestly, we did not know we were this close to the end. Otherwise, we would have done things differently. But I was just like having panic attacks and like couldn't sleep because I was so afraid something was going to happen like on my watch randomly, but not so randomly. My parents ended up being here, and my sister-in-law, who's now a nurse, was here, and he had collapsed in the bathroom and yelled for me to come and help him. And my dad was here and he was able to help me. And my mom scooped up the kids with my sister-in-law and they took off. And it was like 24 hours. Sorry, I'm kind of zigzagging, but 24 hours before he had passed away, I remember kind of getting down on the floor because he was kind of hunched over. So that was the most comfortable for him in a chair. And I was like, hey, like, if you're tired, you don't have to keep doing this. And he was just like, his eyes got super big and he was like kind of offended, I think, but because we hadn't really had any of these types of conversations yet. And I was like, he's like, what do you mean? And I'm just like, we've literally done everything, and if you're tired and exhausted, because everything in him hurt, he couldn't use his feet and his hands because the chemo was so bad, and he could hardly breathe. Like it was like, I started to think like, we get on the other side of this. What is his quality of life even like? It just, things you don't think you're going to have to think about when you're, like 33 years old. And so I just said to him, like, do what you need to do. And I respect you. And me and the kids are going to be great, like, no matter what, And he was like, I can't think about that. And I said, and you don't have to. I said, but you need to know, like, in the depths of you, when you get to that moment that you have to decide, like, it's okay. And like, we're going to be okay. He's like, well, I can't think about that right now. I said, that's fine. You don't have to, but just, tuck this conversation away. And 24 hours later, we were in the hospital, and 24 hours later, he was gone.
Huh. Well, I think I need an emotional break after that. And I'm going to give the audience an emotional break here. So we're going to do just that. And then when we come back, we're going to continue talking to Becky, and we're going to get a better understanding of what this idea of when the day means and where that comes from and how that came about from all this tragedy that she's experienced in her life, and how she's turned that into something really powerful and really beautiful. Thank you for listening to the Mindful Midlife Crisis. Thank you for listening to the Mindful Midlife Crisis. New episodes come out every Wednesday to help you get over the midweek hump. If you'd like to contact me, or if you have suggestions about what you'd like to hear on the show, visit www.mindfulmidlifecrisis.com and click Contact Us. While you're there, don't forget to sign up for the newsletter. You can also click on the show notes for links to the articles and resources we reference throughout the show. If you want to check out my worldly adventures, follow me on Instagram at mindful_midlife_crisis. My hope is that my trials, tribulations, and successes will inspire you to take intentional action to live a more purpose-filled life. And while you're at it, remember to show yourself some love every now and then, too. Thanks again. And now, back to the show. Welcome back to the Mindful Midlife Crisis. We are here with Becky Allen. She is the host of the Win the Day podcast. She has been sharing her story so much, such a emotional, powerful story. I have a range of emotions. I imagine listeners, you do too. And just imagine having lived that and the range of emotions that Becky has experienced too. And Becky, one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on is because, one, to share that story, but then two, you now have this powerful message of win the day, and you do speaking engagements and you host a podcast with this title, Win the Day. So where's that slogan come from? What's the origin of that?
Yeah. So Darren was a big picture thinker. He was super goal oriented and really driven. And so when he was going through this treatment and he was so limited physically, it was incredibly difficult for him because he just felt like, I want to achieve these things, but I physically can't. And he didn't know how to really feel like he was still fulfilling what he was supposed to when he was so limited. And so he went away and he was praying and he had some quiet time. And I remember he walked into the kitchen, and I'll never forget, He came in and the real big eyes, and he looked totally different. I was like, "What happened to you?" Like, what? I don't know what you're doing, but something changed. And he's like, you know how I've been struggling with this, and he's like, "It's win the day." I was like, what do you mean?" He's like, "I need to get up every morning, assess my day, assess how I'm feeling and my abilities. And then I need to give that day everything that I can based off of those things and just win that day. And, if I wake up the next morning, then I'll do it again. But it's just this surrendering of our own plans and desires and sort of submitting to like what God has for you for that day, whether it's people to meet, conversations to have, things to accomplish, or like sometimes winning the day for him meant just like eating, or taking a shower. And sometimes it meant, living a pretty relatively normal day of what that looked like. And so it became this mantra for our family to just like one day at a time, because you can't look out more than one day at a time when you're going through something super tragic. And so that became kind of our marching order. And he was really public when he was going through his battle with cancer. And so he would talk a lot about it. And as he would sign off, he would say, win the day. And it kind of caught on with people and kind of became this mantra and kind of grown from there. And so, uh, you kind of get this different lease on life or freedom, if you will, after you go through something tragic. Cause it's like, gosh, I survived literally the worst thing I thought I could. And like, here I am. There was a moment a couple months after Darren passed that I was walking on the beach. I needed to go on a vacation and be by myself. I just needed to like be alone with myself. I was reading this book at the time called The Rhythm of Life by Matthew Kelly, and it was just sort of a perfect intersection of like where I was at and what I needed to hear. And I had just finished reading this chapter that was like, when have you been your best self? And so I kind of closed the book and then I like went for a walk on the beach and I was like, when have I been my best self? When have I been? And immediately, kind of that like gut response that kind of comes up to the surface right away. And it's like, when have you been your best self? And I'm like, it's right now in this exact moment. But then, think about the other voice on the shoulder that's like, okay, you just lost your husband like 2 months ago, 3 months ago. How can this be your best self right now? Like, who are you kidding? And I'm like, I feel so free to do what I want and to live this life how it sees fit, right? Because you have these moments of clarity, like when you realize how short life really is. And so, anyways, immediately I felt guilty. Like, how could this be like my best life only because of losing someone? And I felt like then it started to kind of become this prayer. And like I was talking to God about it and just like kind of wrestling with this idea. And he was like, the gift of Darren's life, short life, is to help you step into the fullness of your own. And I'm like, that is not right. Like that, that's not right. And he said, of course it is. He said, think about this. Like when you give your kids a gift at Christmas, do you give them a gift because you want them to feel like my gift is way better than yours or to feel guilty? Like, no, you don't give people gifts to feel guilt. You give them out of love. And this is a gift that you need to receive out of love to really step into this like next part of your life. And so that's kind of where this win the day idea started kicking around in my head about what does that look like to pursue my best self, but not in the way that I maybe thought. Like maybe my best self is undoing things more than doing things, and kind of relearning who I am after these hard things and inviting people to come into that.
When you've talked about this a little bit, but you mentioned that after your cancer diagnosis that you stopped taking things for granted
Mhm.
and then there was this second shift. So how did life shift and how did your perspective shift differently from those two? Like what were the different lessons that you took away from each of those situations? Because it sounds like one situation that you've gone through would shift your lens, but then now you go through this next one, and how does it shift it even more?
Yeah. I don't know that they're so different as I would look at them as like building blocks because I really feel like the first experience allowed me in those next, I don't know, 5 or 6 or 7 years, whatever it was, to really be so present and in the moment. And, after that miscarriage and me having cancer, Darren and I decided to start a business together. So we were together all the time. And so we really had pretty good time freedom, but we were able to work together and be together. And so I feel like because of that first like hard thing, it allowed me to be able to really fully like after I lost Darren say like I have zero regrets. Like I don't have any regrets. And so then that really allowed me to continue to like step into this living free space. And I almost feel like it's funny because I've met a lot of widows actually because of like young widows who have lost their spouses too. And there is definitely this euphoric season, I'll call it, of losing someone where you have this like YOLO attitude of like, I'm doing all of the things. I am saying yes to everything. I don't give a crap about what anybody else thinks. Like, I am living life large. And you're just in this mode because it's been heavy for so long. And not that grief ever leaves you, but then there's all of a sudden this like shift of like, but wait, I'm still living. And what do I want? This can be anything I want. Like, I thought my life was kind of planned out ish. And now it's a completely blank page. And so there's this freedom that kind of comes through that I feel like because I didn't have any guilt or regrets about how I lived in the past, like I was really able to like embrace that and move forward with the understanding of like nothing is really guaranteed.
Well, as you were talking about being married young at 22 and then having your first child, do you ever look back on your experiences and think to yourself, boy, I was on the freeway to living a very comfortable but potentially complacent life had this just gone without incident, without me going through cancer, without me having miscarriages, without Darren having cancer and losing him. Has that ever popped into your mind in any way, shape, or form of like, boy, I was on easy street here for a while, but it doesn't sound like easy street would have suited you. Does that make sense?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, it's an interesting thought. I don't think it was necessarily a complacent way of living, although maybe this is just a different way to say it. But
And
I
I don't
definitely,
mean that. Let me clarify that what I meant was that things were getting comfortable with the potential for it to become like complacent or kind of boringly stable, that kind of thing. So not to say that
mhm,
where you were at that time was complacent, but meaning that there was the potential that you would just get into the routine and the
yeah,
rut because things kind of just happen pretty easily in those first year or two of marriage. Is
mhm.
that kind of clarified a bit?
Yeah, I would say the thought that I have sort of regarding what you just sort of flushed out more than anything is I wonder if there's like a level of depth and dimension that I've learned about myself that I would have missed. Right. And that, like, would I have ever been able to find this like depth or version of myself had I not gone through these experiences? Like, would I have ever met this version of me? And I've talked about that with a fair amount of people. And I don't know that there's really been a conclusive answer that I've had with people. I personally don't think I would have. But that's the part that I wonder about, is like, would I still have met these parts of me? And I it's funny because in therapy we joke that like sometimes I feel like I'm like a 22-year-old living in like, but also like I feel like I'm also like 80. Because it's like there's this newfound freedom and like I never really was single and had this time to myself, right? I mean, obviously I'm a mom, but you know what I'm saying? Like, and then, but also like living this like widowed life and being like so reflective at such a young age about things that most people don't think about until they're older. So it's like this interesting dynamic sometimes that I feel like a weird conglomeration of personalities or ages or I don't know.
Well, in the beginning, when we introduced you, you said that your podcast focuses on how hard things change you. And so I like that you say, I don't know that I would have gotten to the depths of who I am today, that I wouldn't know me as well as
Hmm.
I know myself now had I not gone through those things. You have a really strong faith in God, but
Hmm.
on Instagram, It's interesting. You describe yourself as a broken believer. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, great question. I think that kind of comes back a little bit to my anti-expert messaging in the sense of I don't ever want to arrive or have things all figured out. And when you have things all figured out, there you don't need anything. You don't need people, you don't need relationships, and you don't need a faith, in my opinion. And so it's acknowledging that like I am not strong enough on my own. Like I do not have it all together. Like I have major flaws and things that I am a broken person, you know? And so that's where God's grace comes in that kind of covers those areas for me and really gives me a purpose, gives my short little time on earth weight knowing that there's more to come and really is like a total game changer for me. And that's why perspective is so important for me because I really believe there's an eternal perspective. It's not just like we're here and then we're gone. And that to me changes how you live.
Well, Becky, I just really want to thank you so much for your vulnerability and sharing your story with our listeners. Go check out the Win the Day podcast with Becky Allen. You can also follow her on Instagram at Becky_Allen. You can go to www.winthedaypro.com. You guys have shirts there, I think, correct?
We do. Yeah, we've got some Win the Day apparel for sure. Some hats and t-shirts and some more stuff coming out later this fall and summer as well, or winter as well. So,
And there's a story behind that, correct? How did this apparel come to be?
yeah, we have such a great community of people that were so supportive while Darren was going through this cancer treatment. And so we had friends take this Win the Day slogan and put it on t-shirts and sell them as a fundraiser. And we sold thousands of t-shirts. So it was so cool. I would get texts from friends like, I'm in the Denver airport. I just saw a Win the Day t-shirt, or like, we're at Disney World and I just saw a Win the Day t-shirt. And so it was kind of this movement. And people kept asking like, can we get a sweatshirt? Can we put this in red? Could you put it on a hat? And so, we had a friend that came and visited us when Darren was sick. And she like, as was leaving, she was like skirting out the door to her car and she turned on, she was, oh, I was supposed to tell you, I was praying for you guys this morning and I felt like I'm supposed to tell you to start the Win the Day apparel and it's supposed to be like this lifestyle brand. And she kind of scooted away and him and I kind of looked at each other like, this never crossed our mind. So that's kind of where it came. People kept being like, are you going to do this? We want more. I'm like, all right, well, if I don't do it, someone else will. So that's sort of where it's come from and has been a good reminder for people because it's just so applicable to so many different hard things. And it's a great perspective for people to have as they move through them to the other side.
Well, it's a beautiful message that continues to share a beautiful story. And we want to thank you again. If you want some Win the Day apparel, go to www.winthedaypro.com. See what they have there. Get in touch with Becky. You're just a wonderful person. It's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for sharing your story, Becky.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, if you enjoyed this week's episode, be sure to look in the show notes for all of Becky's contact information. Don't forget to subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple listener, you can do that by clicking the plus sign in the upper right-hand corner. Also, please do me a favor and leave a 5-star review with a few kind words. Or if you're a Spotify listener, click those 5 stars under the show art after you click the follow button. If you'd like to share your thoughts on this week's episode, you can find all of my contact information in the show notes as well. Feel free to email me your takeaways from this conversation at mindfulmidlifecrisis@gmail.com. You can also follow me and DM me on Instagram at mindful_midlife_crisis. You can find me on LinkedIn at Billy Lahr, that's Lahr, or you can send a message to the contact page at www.mindfulmidlifecrisis.com. While you're there, feel free to sign up for the newsletter so you can get access to the free meditations I send out every Sunday. Finally, I know Becky and I would greatly appreciate it if you would share this episode with the people in your life who may benefit from Becky's expertise and life experiences. Remember, the purpose of this show is to help you navigate the complexities and possibilities of life's second half, and I hope this conversation provides some insight that will help you reflect, learn, and grow so you can live a more purpose-filled life. So for Becky, this is Billy. Thank you for listening to the Mindful Midlife Crisis. May you feel happy, healthy, and loved. Take care, friends.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the Mindful Midlife Crisis podcast. We hope you enjoyed this week's episode. If this episode resonates with you, please share it with your family and friends. We will do our best to put out new content every Wednesday to get you over the midweek hump. If you want episodes to be downloaded automatically to your phone each week, all you need to do is hit the checkmark, subscribe, like, or follow button, depending on what podcast format you're using. While you're at it, feel free to leave our show a quick 5-star review with a few kind words so more people like you can easily find our show. If you're really enjoying the show and you want to help us out, feel free to make a donation to www.buymeacoffee.com/MMC podcast. That's www.buymeacoffee.com/MMC podcast. You can also access the link in our show notes. We use the money from these donations to pay whatever expenses we incur from producing the show, but ultimately, we record this show for you. So if you keep listening, we'll keep recording and releasing new episodes each week regardless. If you'd like to contact us, or if you have suggestions about what you'd like us to discuss on future episodes, feel free to email us at mindfulmidlifecrisis@gmail.com or follow us on Instagram at mindful_midlife_crisis. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to the articles and resources we reference throughout the show. Thanks again for listening. May you feel happy, healthy, and loved.